We need to be taking serious action and use the markets. Conservative politicians believe in the importance of the markets, and that's what putting a price on pollution is. It's saying, you know what, you're going to pay a bit more if you pollute, you will pay less if you pollute, and you'll innovate.
Mr. McKenna, thank you so much for your time today.
It's great. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the weekend.
You just heard Catherine McKenna on Canada's role in climate talks at the G20. How realistic are Canada's goals going into the summit? To talk about that, I'm joined by Celine Bach, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation and a co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Climate Policy and Finance. Celine Bach, welcome to the House.
It's a pleasure to be here, Catherine.
Now, you heard a bit of what Minister Catherine McKenna had to say there. What stood out for you?
Well, I think the minister is optimistic, and I think she is looking for positive signals from Hamburg on a consensus on climate change and on climate action. I think that there will be 19 of the leaders at the table for the discussion on climate change and climate action. I don't think that there'll be fewer than that, and so that's really what we're going to be looking for in the next few hours.
What is your best case scenario? It's something I asked her, but what do you think is the most we could hope to see from the United States out of this?
Well, there's an appendix to that has been written, to come out sort of alongside the communique, which is the climate and energy action plan. It's very specific and very concrete. It goes into energy efficiency. It goes into making sure that people have access to electricity. These are all important things for the G20. It also talks about the importance of sustainable infrastructure, and the very best case scenario would be for President Trump to sign on to that. Perhaps that's not in the cards, in which case the agreement of 19 of the world's global leaders to that action plan would, I think, be a very important accomplishment.
So essentially buying into some of the principles that underpin this discussion around climate change, even if he isn't on side with the Paris Accord. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, the principles and the economic opportunity, as the minister discussed. I mean, the Brookings Institute came out with a study that we're going to need to invest between $5 and $7 trillion every year for the next 13 years in order to provide the foundations, the energy foundations, the infrastructure foundations that we're going to need to decarbonize the economy. That's a huge economic opportunity, and I find it quite unlikely that President Trump would want to step away from that part of the climate change conversation.
I want to ask you about something interesting that you wrote recently. You wrote just a few weeks ago, the Paris Climate Agreement is like the Olympic Games, and the point that you made is that the approach is going to rely on all parties to participate in their highest capacity. Can we have an Olympic Games, though, without the United States?
Well, it's interesting. I think that given the president's personality, it's unlikely that he would not want to come to those Olympic Games. So if we talk about it in that way, it is actually something that I think certainly the states and the U.S. cities, as well as significant parts of the large corporations in the U.S., they want to be part of that Olympic Games. And I think you're probably aware of the fact that the highest growth, most important job in the U.S. right now is wind turbine technician, right? So
I didn't know that.
The jobs are there, absolutely. It's a very important part of the U.S. economy and a very important part of certain states and their clean energy system.
How much does this discussion that's happening right now in Hamburg really matter? What are the consequences going forward, depending on whether or not people are able to get on the same page at this particular meeting?
Well, we don't have that much time. So the Earth has the capacity, like a balloon, to take on a certain amount of carbon. And just think of it as a balloon that has a certain amount of carbon in it already. And there's room for another 800 gigatons of carbon. Let's just talk about that as our sort of last. That's it. We have no more room after that. We're emitting carbon as a world population at a rate which suggests that we need to start reducing the rate of emission very quickly, so that we can actually keep global warming to only 2 degrees. And in Paris, we did promise to a number of small island states and to countries that have a lot of coastline that we'd actually try to bring that down to 1.5 degrees. So it's fundamentally important. We can't wait for another presidency to really move forward with what the commitments that have been made in Paris and to actually achieving those, not just making those commitments.
I want to talk about what Canada's role is in all of this. What is the thing that you would most like to see Canada do right now?
Well, Canada's playing the role of the quiet diplomat right now, right? So it's one-on-one speaking to individual leaders, whether they are finance ministers or ministers of foreign affairs. Both. We have a team in Hamburg now, and their quiet diplomacy is very important because it inspires confidence, because if Canada is prepared to stand on this matter, then others will be prepared to stand as well. Part of quiet diplomacy is also pointing out enlightened self-interest. It is not in Russia's interest to pick a fight with the EU. The EU is its largest customer for its natural gas. It is also not in Saudi Arabia's enlightened self-interest to pick a fight with China, which is taking on a leadership role on climate. And so for all those reasons, I think Canada has an important role to play.
Yeah, and I do want to jump in because you raised China there. Tell me about how credible China is, how you look at China's role in this broader fight against climate change.
Well, China is betting its next wave of industrialization on a low-carbon economy. The first wave of industrialization included solar panels and wind turbines, and now they're moving very quickly to electric vehicles and to the infrastructure that the low-carbon economy requires. It's also being very deliberate in its approach to low-carbon finance, to green finance, whether that's green bonds or new products to provide guarantees in terms of climate goals. I mean, the Chinese are very serious about taking a leadership role in terms of the capital markets that are going to underpin the low-carbon economy. I think it's important for us to also bear in mind that although China is the largest emitter today, their total emissions, if we go back to that balloon and the 2,200 gigatons of CO2 we've already put in it, China's responsible for 11% of that. That's less than half of what the EU and the US have put in over time on a cumulative basis. So while we can certainly be concerned about the current emissions in China, we also have to bear in mind that the EU and the US have emitted a great deal more than China has since we've begun to fill the air with CO2.
It is ultimately such a complex situation, just the scope of it all, obviously internationally. And I just wonder, what do you think is the one thing that you would hope that Canadians take away from the discussions that are going on right now? What's the one thing they need to know about all of this?
Well, we all have to depend on each other in regards to a low-carbon economy and climate change. No one country's action is sufficient, right? This is truly the case where multilateralism is at the very core, and where our leadership as the quiet diplomats, the people who do what we say and say what we do, is very important in making sure that the confidence and the trust between global leaders is maintained and grows over time.
Celine Bach, thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
So what do you think about Canada's role in fighting climate change? How much climate clout does Canada have on the world stage? Let us know. Our email address is thehouse@cbc.ca. You can also get in touch on Twitter. Our handle here is @CBCTheHouse. And mine is @Kath_Cullen. Or there's always the website, cbc.ca/radio/thehouse, where you can click on the contact link right at the top of the page. The Government of Canada has reached a deal with Omar Khadr, a settlement that CBC News has confirmed is worth $10.5 million, as well as an official apology. Here's Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale explaining why.
The Supreme Court of Canada has said clearly and unequivocally that behavior on the part of those Canadian officials was wrong. And you may want to dismiss the rule of law and the Constitution, but if you do that, you are fundamentally undermining the integrity of the country.
So did the government need to make this deal? Joining me now is Conservative MP Erin O'Toole, who was also a cabinet minister in the Harper government. Welcome back to the House.
Good to be with you.
So I want to start by talking about that tape we just heard from Ralph Goodale. What do you think of what the government is saying about all this?
Well, the irony of ironies is Ralph Goodale is the only government official of Canada's government that has been involved in all parts of the mistakes and the violations of the Cotter file. In fact, the visits of Canadian officials he's talking about that were chartered violations happened when Mr. Goodale was a cabinet minister in the Martin and Chrétien governments. And in fact, going way back to when the Chrétien government lobbied for Omar Khadr's father to be released in Pakistan, he was involved in that government as well. So the irony is this is such a saga that we lose track of when the violations occurred. There was 3 violations of Mr. Khadr's charter rights in Guantanamo, and that's when the Chrétien and Martin governments sent officials down to question him.
Do you accept, you're very clearly putting this on the shoulders of the Liberals, the time span I believe that we're talking about for all of this is the Chrétien, Martin, and Harper years. You do accept, though, then, that there were violations of Mr. Khadr's charter rights, and do you accept that there should be an apology for that?
Well, there were 3 limited violations that the Supreme Court in 2010 outlined, and that was when officials traveled down. The third one, in the Martin government, was most problematic because they saw there was interrupted sleep patterns, what they called the frequent flyer program. They were waking up detainees, and that doesn't fly with our system of justice, clearly. So the interviews were inappropriate and were charter violations. The challenge here is when someone is questioned in prison, they're there as a result of their conduct. In this case, Mr. Khadr took the life of Christopher Speer. It's documented that he was making IEDs, so there's potentially more lives he was involved in taking. So he doesn't come to this process with clean hands. And generally, in tort law, this civil action he's brought, you don't find a reward when you come from an illegal or immoral act. And I don't think it's justifiable for a government to compensate someone for a process that began with his illegal activities.
And yet, if we look at that Supreme Court ruling, and there have been a few, but I want to reference the one from 2010 here, the court writes, the deprivation of Khadr's right to liberty and security of the person is not in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. They write also that Canada's participation in the illegal process in place at Guantanamo Bay clearly violated Canada's binding international obligations. So you are making the point that these are narrow, specific obligations. Those sound like quite broad violations to me.
No, they're actually quite narrow. The Charter does not apply to Canadians that leave Canada, particularly for Canadians that go and commit terror offenses or fight with ISIS. You don't have charter rights outside of Canada. It's a construct called extraterritoriality. The Supreme Court realized that Canada inserted itself into Guantanamo when they questioned Mr. Khadr and shared the results of that questioning with the U.S. Those were the violations. They were violations, but they were in fact quite limited